thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. So this right here, the Victorinox Cybertool Large, has been my EDC pocket tool for a good while now, about 7 months or so to be more precise. And during that time, it has turned out to be probably the single most capable and useful Swiss Army knife that I've ever owned. Which makes it all the more frustrating to think about how Victorinox themselves apparently do not care about it at all. But anyway, before we get into how Victorinox is, in my opinion, doing their customers a huge disservice with this guy, let's begin by talking about why you would even consider carrying something like this. And then I will talk you through all of the tools that are on here and how I use them in my day-to-day life. So let's go. I carry this guy basically for the same reason why I carry a smartphone with me every single day. And the reason is that it is just super useful. Now, I'm obviously not saying that this does the same things as a smartphone. These are different tools for different jobs. What both have in common, however, is that they are compromises in their respective fields. For example, I can obviously use my iPhone to write emails, take photos, or watch Netflix, but at the same time, it's also not as good at any of the aforementioned things as a dedicated laptop with a keyboard, a mirrorless camera, and a huge TV to watch Netflix on would be. With that being said, the smartphone is obviously still more convenient than any of the aforementioned. So just think about how often you are, for example, talking to someone about something and you want to just quickly look something up. And so you can just easily do that with the smartphone that you're carrying in your pockets. But just imagine that you would have to go downstairs every single time, grab your laptop, fire it up, look something up, then put it away back again, and then return to your conversation. In that case, you would simply not bother doing that at all. What I'm saying is that while the smartphone is not necessarily the best tool for that job, it is certainly the most convenient one in most day-to-day situations. And the same thing is kind of true for something like the Victorinox Cybertool Large here, because none of the tools that are on that Victorinox are as good as their full-size counterparts would be. But then again, you don't have to grab them if you always have this guy on you. So imagine you need to cut off a thread that's hanging loose from your clothes. Well, you could go to the kitchen, search for a pair of scissors and do it, or you could just do it with the thing that you have in your pocket. And so that's why something like this Victorinox, or maybe also a Leatherman Wave or other Leatherman tools, are often referred to as having a tool chest that fits into the palm of your hand. And that's exactly what it is, even though none of the tools on there are as good as their full-size counterparts would be. But they don't have to be, because it's simply more convenient. And so that's the general idea of carrying something like this. But in the same way that some people simply do not understand how carrying a smartphone could be useful, and they are like, well, I didn't need something like this for the majority of my life and I did get by just fine. I think in the same way, some people are simply completely clueless how something like this might be beneficial to carry for them in their day-to-day life and how it might actually be useful to do so. So what I want to do now is go through the tools that are on this Victorinox and just give you a few examples of how and why I'm using this on a day-to-day basis. But all of the tools in the world are completely useless if you don't know how to use them. And that's where Skillshare comes into play, who are kindly sponsoring today's video. With the summer in full swing, I have plans to use those longer summer evenings to work on some projects, especially in regards to designing and building furniture, as there are a couple of pieces that I would like to build before our baby is born later this year. And in order to do that better and more efficiently, I wanted to get deeper into furniture design and especially using stuff like SketchUp for a good while now. But even for someone like myself who has dabbled in furniture building before, this stuff can honestly be a bit overwhelming and a bit challenging. But using those classes on Skillshare, I was able to get a ton of information in a very straightforward and no-nonsense fashion. For those of you who don't know about Skillshare, it is the largest online learning community with thousands of classes led by industry experts across all various different fields like film, illustration, design, all sorts of crafting and so on. And so Skillshare can help you to take your career skills, hobbies, passions or your side hustle to the next next level. So it doesn't matter if you want to up your photography game, or you want to get better at designing and building furniture like I'm doing myself right now, or maybe you just want to learn some Spanish for beginners before your next vacation. Skillshare certainly has got you covered. And the first 500 people to use my link in the description below will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today. And with that, thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to the Victorinox Cybertool Large. Let's quickly talk about the form factor, because obviously this is not exactly the most compact pocket tool you could buy, which I think is also why this large Cybertool is often overlooked in the EDC community, because it just looks like it is super clumsy, heavy and too unwieldy to carry. Undeservedly so, if you ask me, because while yes, it is obviously big and bulky for a Victorinox, it is still just about as big as my car key, and I don't see people bitching about carrying their car keys either. Also, when you compare it to one of its main rivals, this Leatherman Wave for example, it's not looking too bad for the old Cybertool either. Now, is the Leatherman more capable as a pocket tool? Well, that's debatable if you ask me. It certainly does have the bigger pliers, that's for sure. But obviously that doesn't mean that the Cybertool isn't worth its size and weight. With that being said, if after watching this video or maybe trying it out for yourself, you still come to the conclusion that you simply do not need the tools that are on this Swiss Army knife, well, obviously it doesn't make sense for you to carry it. But if you think this might be useful, I would encourage you not to disregard this because of its size and weight. One other complaint that Victorinoxes in general often get is that they don't have a pocket clip, and so they are always sitting low down in your pockets, and that's just sort of uncomfortable to carry, which is something that I do absolutely get. Now, a pocket clip on this knife wouldn't really work, but I just have a round carabiner and this KeySmart pocket clip attached to it. The pocket clip allows me to have the Cybertool suspended in my pocket instead of just chilling at the bottom, which is much more comfortable, and thanks to the carabiner, removing the clip is fast and easy. Good stuff. So yeah, it is bulky, but not too bulky. But with that out of the way, let's talk functionality. Starting off with the two knife blades. As you can see, there is a big and a small one on here. Now, having a blade on here is obviously just an essential that no pocket tool would be complete without, but some might say that it is unnecessary to have two blades. However, it can actually be quite useful. The longer blade is my primary choice for food processing or bigger cutting, carving and slicing jobs, which it does very well. Thanks to its full flat grind and not overly fat profile, it is a good enough slicer without sacrificing too much in terms of durability. So this is obviously good for just a whole lot of things. But overall, it's a knife, it is the essential tool to carry, and this one works really well. A quick word about the blade steel though, this is the exact same blade steel that you'd get on any other Victorinox knife, meaning that it is rather soft, it doesn't hold an edge for too long, but at the same time it is super easy to resharpen back to a razor edge, and that kind of works for its intended purpose. Obviously, it's not any sort of super fancy super steel like everyone in the EDC community is craving nowadays, but it works really well for a knife that is intended to be used out in the real world and not just as a prop to flex on Instagram. Also, it is a slip joint, so no, the blade does not lock at all, and it doesn't even have a half stop like other slip joint knives sometimes have. And some might consider this to be a bit of a safety issue, and they are kind of right. Obviously, there is a bigger danger of this blade closing in on your hands while you're using it than there would be with a locking knife, but at the same time, me personally, I've been using Victorinox knives with that slip joint mechanism for, I don't know, 25 plus years or so, and I have yet to cut myself by having the knife closing in on itself while I'm using it. I think that unless you're stabbing something or you're using the knife in a very stupid and irresponsible way, the risk of that happening is fairly low. Anyway, let's talk about the small blade. It is a bit thinner and therefore even slicier than the big one. Some people just use it as a box opener, which I get, why not but I don't do that because I actually use this as my preferred blade for finer and more detailed whittling projects, and therefore I want to keep all sort of tape residue off of the blade to keep it clean and sharp all of the time. Now granted, this fat chunky thing would probably not be the most ergonomic choice for a long whittling project, and I haven't used it for that, but again, you can just use it in a pinch if you want to. And if you look at the same small blade on something a bit thinner like this Victorinox Huntsman, you can see how it somewhat resembles an actual whittling knife. So in between those two blades, you got a lot of stuff covered. The large wood and metal file is super aggressive, it can be used on anything, and the edge even works as a saw to cut through softer metals and aluminium. You can also use it to trim down your nails a bit, as maybe I have occasionally, but you have to be aware that this guy removes an insane amount of material super quickly. Again, this guy is super aggressive, it's not your typical nail file, it's more of a metal or wood file. But hey, also again, it's just super helpful to have on you, not just for a manly manicure while you're out and about smashing life, but also to clean stuff like electrical contacts, saw off nails, take off the burr off of something like cut pipe or whatever. Overall very useful, the possibilities are really endless here and I wouldn't want to be without it. The wood saw really needs no explanation. It is the same saw as it is on all other bigger Victorinox models like the Huntsman, the Farmer and so on, and they all work just really well. The saw is super aggressive and it gets a lot done for its size. Unlike other manufacturers, Victorinox really thinks their saws through. And so the spine of this saw is a bit thinner than the cutting edge so that your saw blade doesn't get stuck or develop friction when you're getting deeper into the wood. It's a joy to use and I often also use it for stuff like those rib cuts if you're just trying to get a few twigs off of a branch. And even though it's certainly not the most used to on this guy, in my opinion, a Swiss Army knife just has to have a saw in order to be complete. Now let's talk scissors really quick. Have you ever been in a situation where you just ripped off some food or sauce package and just spilled everything everywhere because the stupid rip open lashes just simply do not ever work? Well, I have, but luckily you could also just use the scissors of something like this Victorinox Cybertool in order to make the whole process just a lot more clean and civilized. Victorinox scissors are famous for being just the best in the business, and these are no exceptions. I primarily use these to open food packages, cut off loose threads from my clothes, and to cut zip ties. Works like a charm, and it also just somehow feels very civilized and sophisticated to open stuff with this instead of just brute force ripping them open or cutting them open with a knife. And then there are the pliers. Now technically speaking, these are actually combination pliers. There is even a tiny wire cutter in there. Wait, let me grab a magnifying glass so you can see them. There they are, told ya. Truth be told though, I haven't yet had a need to use them to cut wires within the 7 months or so that I've been carrying this Cybertool, even though I occasionally do stuff like maybe hang up a new lamp or whatever. But if I do that, I need to grab my full tool set anyway. Nothing saving me from that, and so when I'm doing that, I'm simply not going to grab my Cybertool out of my pocket. I'm just using the full-size tools anyway. So having bigger pliers or bigger wire cutters is not something that I personally need on a day-to-day basis, and if I would need it, I would certainly just carry a Leatherman instead of this Cybertool. But hey, the pliers are still there, they are certainly useful, and hey, you also get those tiny wire cutters and they work well enough to cut some copper wire, so why not, I guess. Mind you though, it's certainly not like I'm not using these pliers at all, quite the opposite actually, but I use them for different tasks. For example, I use these small pliers to grab or hold things that I otherwise wouldn't be able to touch, like opening or closing the piping hot air vents on my grill or holding a small nail in position if I don't feel like smashing my fingers with a hammer that day. It's also very handy to get into tight spots that you might otherwise not be able to reach into, like if something has fallen beside your car seat or whatever. It also does a very fine job at removing staples and nails, which is something that I had to do very frequently over the past few weeks. So again, even despite its size, it's still super useful and I would say adequately sized for my day-to-day use cases. But with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the party trick of this Cybertool, and that is of course the bit holder. It is the unique standalone feature that defines the entire Cybertool range. I was honestly genuinely surprised how often I've been using this tool and how quickly I missed it if I decided to carry something else, even just for a day or two. For those of you who are not familiar, all Victorinox Cybertools come with this bit driver and bit holder. It's a 4mm driver that opens fully to give you an inline screwdriver or at a 90-degree angle so you can apply more torque for those tighter screws. The bits are all double-sided with 3 in the bit holder and 1 in the driver, giving you a grand total of 4 bits and therefore 8 usable bits. The bits are held in place with this little ball bearing thing, which works well enough. Retention could be a bit better if you ask me, but whatever. The bit selection it comes with is also good and very useful for a lot of things that might come up on a day-to-day basis. So with this you get a flat head as well as the number 0, 1 and 2 Phillips, a 4mm hex and a T8, T10 and T15 Torx bit. The Torx bits can also be used for some smaller hex screws like 2, 2.5 and 3mm, but be sure not to use too much torque if you're doing that, as not to round them off. A big benefit with this long and slim driver is that it enables you to tighten or undo screws even when they are in set. And again, with the option to attack a screw, with this 90-degree handle position you are able to use a lot of torque, especially when you also consider that you have this brick of a knife to hold onto as a handle. It's a killer feature and comes in handy all the time. Especially the 4mm hex tool for me gets used on an almost daily basis. However, with that being said, this particular tool is also the source for my biggest gripe with the entire Cybertool range. But before we talk about that, let's quickly go through the rest of the tools that are on this Cybertool. So just like with most 91mm Victorinox knives, this one also has that typical opener layer featuring a bottle opener that also doubles as a flathead screwdriver or pry tool, whichever you prefer. It also offers a very useful 90-degree half-stop position for added torque, and it even sports a wire stripper. My most used application for this is probably mounting tripod plates or again removing staples, and it does it really well. Then there's the can opener with that smaller flathead on the top. I have honestly only ever used this tool to open boxes, and truth be told, it's not the greatest tool for that either. So if you were to ask me, I would love it if Victorinox would switch this tool out in exchange for the actual package opener, like the one they are featuring on some of their newer models like the Companion. Anyway, those are all of the tools that you get on the front side of the Cybertool, so let's quickly go through the tools that are on the back side of the Cybertool as well as the scale tools. On the back side we have a corkscrew, which I have actually used to open a few wine bottles, and it works great for that, as you would expect. More importantly though, it also houses a small screwdriver, or in my case, a small sim tool, which is perfect for making micro adjustments on the metal wristband of my watch. So especially on those warmer days, this usually gets used multiple times a day as my wrist shrinks or swells up during the day. Then there's the chisel, which I have only used a few times this far. I like the idea of having a small chisel, but with the way that it sits on this tool, it's honestly a bit awkward to use in my opinion. Anyway, moving on to this small, I don't know, screwdriver I guess. The only time I have used this tool was to get into and pry off the scales of another Victorinox, so yeah, certainly not something I use on a regular basis. Unlike this, however, this little parcel hook is just a godsend if you remember that you have it at the right time. It's basically there to aid you whenever you want to grab something that would otherwise dig or cut into your hand. For example, I carry this little credit card sized tool in my wallet that can technically be used to tighten or loosen nuts, but as you can imagine, it's not exactly comfortable to put a lot of pressure onto something like this. Now enter the hook. With this guy you can pull on this card so hard, you are really able to easily undo most nuts and bolts on something like a bicycle. Lastly, there's also an awl on here. Again, not exactly my most used tool, but it can be handy in a pinch to drill a hole into a piece of wood or leather, and you can obviously also use it to strike a ferro rod. Talking about ferro rods, let's not forget about the scale tools. We got the plus scales, so that means that you have a small ballpoint pen, a pair of wonderful Victorinox tweezers, a small metal pin that lives under the corkscrew, and usually a toothpick, but I replaced that toothpick with a small ferro rod. Oh yeah, and technically Victorinox also refers to this keychain ring as a tool, which is honestly a bit of a stretch, but hey, it's good to have, and as stated in the beginning, I usually have my Cybertool on a KeySmart pocket clip to suspend it in my pockets, and I use one of those round little carabiner rings so that I can quickly remove the pocket clip when I actually want to use the Cybertool. And those are all of the tools that you get on this large Cybertool. Obviously, the aforementioned applications for those tools are just a few examples because the possibilities are really endless here. And so, as you can hopefully imagine by now, it is a truly useful companion to have on you on a day-to-day basis. One last benefit that I also want to mention, because it is actually one of the main deciding factors for me to carry this instead of something like, well, most Leathermans, I guess, and that is the fact that the Cybertool is actually legal to carry in most countries as far as I'm aware, especially here in the EU. And the same can sadly not be said about most of the Leathermans that are available on the market right now. And that's for the simple reason that the Victorinox, again, only features slip joint blades, whereas those Leatherman knives often feature locking blades, and sometimes even blades that are not only locking but also one-handed opening, and so that makes them illegal to carry here in Germany. So yeah, even though some of those Leathermans would actually be more functional, at least in some ways, they are simply not an option where I live. But anyway, let's talk about the big issue, the elephant in the corner. What's wrong with the bit holder? Well, it's not exactly the bit holder or the bit driver itself, but more so the bit selection. It's not exactly that the bit selection is bad, quite the opposite, it's sensible, but by God, Victorinox, if you design a pocket tool with a bit driver and exchangeable bits, why on earth wouldn't you also sell more different bits and maybe even a separate bit holder so that one could customize the bit selection or expand it if necessary? I mean, Leatherman does it, and I would certainly be willing to pay for it, so I simply don't know what's up with that. I mean, this is one of their most expensive models, but apparently Victorinox thinks that the kind of person who would be willing to spend this kind of money to have a fully spec'd out Cybertool instead of a Swiss champ, probably specifically to have the added benefit of that bit driver, would not want to spend more money to get more bits. I honestly really don't get it. All I can tell you is that I've been in a few situations where it would have been super nice to have some other bits, like especially a 3mm hex bit would have come in clutch so many times, and yes, I can use one of those smaller Torx bit for that, but it's really not ideal. And having to work around in that sense just also feels super frustrating. Sadly, it's also not possible to just go out and buy just any regular 4mm bit set and simply use those, because the way that Victorinox has designed that bit driver and their bits, it really only works if you have bits with that ball retention. And well, at least I could not find even a single bit kit that uses those ball retention things. And so yeah, some people just glue a small magnet to the bottom of that bit driver, but I simply do not want to do that because that actually might create other complications. But anyway, even despite all of that, I still think that the Victorinox Cybertool Large is the most complete pocket tool that money can buy on the market right now, at least for those of us who live in the EU and who want to carry their multi-tool on them on a daily basis. But again, it's also super frustrating because in my opinion, it is just a wasted opportunity by Victorinox. I don't get why they are developing a separate bit holder and a bit driver and then they don't release any bits for that guy. I just do not get it. But anyway, let's stop whinging. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was interesting to you. If it was, let me know by giving this video a thumbs up. And if you want to see more content about EDC gear, photography and all of that good stuff, feel free to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care. Bye.